Please turn to Hosea chapter 5, which is our chapter this evening. Hosea is after the book of Daniel, and it's page 875 in Church Bibles. The prophet Hosea, chapter 5. Our plan, God willing, is each time we have a Bible study, because from time to time we have prayer meetings, is to do one chapter of Hosea each time. So, chapter 5 today. I need to remind you of the geography, that in the north part of Palestine is one nation, in the southern part of Palestine is another. Now, the northern nation has two names. This is actually very important as we read through Hosea. The northern nation is sometimes called Israel, but as often as not, and particularly in Hosea, it's called Ephraim. And that's where Hosea is preaching in the 8th century before Christ. And like all prophets, of course, he's the mouthpiece of God, and his message is God. And his dealings with us, and particularly his dealings with us when we're spiritually cold and backsliding. And I need to say again what I've said on previous weeks, that God doesn't always deal with a backslider in the same way. He uses a combination of ways. Sometimes he leaves us to burn our fingers, and then when we're really hurt, we come back to him. Sometimes he rebukes us very severely. We all know that experience. And sometimes his tenderness breaks our hearts, because he's so loving and generous, and we're so unthankful and really rebellious. And usually God uses all these methods together to win our wandering souls back again. And that's the message of Hosea. You'll see, if you've got the New King James Version, that chapter 5 is about impending judgment, certain judgment. And it's a very straightforward chapter. He will expose his people's sins, and then he will show them what's going to happen to them. And he will expose our sins, some of them, and we will understand a little what may happen to us. So we'll do two things this evening. We'll look at the passage briefly, and then we'll draw out one or two lessons. So we're in Hosea chapter 5. Let's first of all go to verses 1 and 2. Hear this, O priests. Take heed, O house of Israel. Give ear, O house of the king, for yours is the judgment. Because you have been a snare to Mizpah and a net spread on Tabor. The revolters are deeply involved in slaughter, though I rebuke them all. Now, sometimes in this book, Hosea speaks straight to the priests. He does that there, verse 1. Sometimes he speaks to the people. He does that in the next line. And sometimes he speaks to the royal court, which he does in the third line. Now here, everybody's under fire. So he's not singling out any particular strata in the nation. He's speaking to the whole people. It's a terrible message. What was this nation of Israel? It was a nation which, with Judah, the 12 tribes, had been chosen by God to lead the world to a proper understanding of God. The commission which God had given to Israel was to be a light to the world, to be a light to the Gentiles, to show the world who is God and what his ways are, what his will is, how he's to be worshipped. And instead of that, we're told here in verses 1 and 2 that the nation had now become a menace. Imagine walking through the forest and a man-trap gets you. That's exactly the picture which is here. But instead of enjoying the walk, you're now caught. And they're a menace. It's a snare. You have been a snare to Mizpah. And you're a fish swimming in the sea, and then you're pulled up in the net, and the life's taken out of you. You are a net spread on Tabor. Now, Mizpah was famous in Israel's history. There were several places called Mizpah. We don't know particularly which one is mentioned here. But for example, Mizpah was where Samuel prayed one of his great prayers, made one of his great speeches. And in that very place now, which is a high place, there is, of course, the worship of Baal. That's why they're a snare. And Tabor was very well known in the story of Deborah and Barak. And in that place of great deliverance, where God worked such a wonderful miracle, there is a high place There's one of these Canaanite cultic places with all its fertility rites and all its filth and degradation. And the prophet Hosea, for all his tenderness, is speaking directly to that situation. And we have to raise the question that if he was here today, who would he speak to today? What institutions would he point the finger at today? What churches would he point the finger at? What individual people would he say, you were intended to be a blessing. You once were a blessing. But now look at you. You actually create spiritual trouble, and you're actually spiritually dangerous. And worse, of course, in verse 2, the revolters are deeply involved in slaughter, though I rebuke them all. With irreligion, of course, goes immorality, and with the no God, no law, inevitably murder becomes something which is little and lightly thought of. So this is the sort of passage we're facing today. It's very, very stern. Let's look now at verses 3 to 7. I know Ephraim, and Israel is not hidden from me. For now, O Ephraim, you commit prostitution. Israel is defiled. They do not direct their deeds toward turning to their God. For the spirit of prostitution is in their midst, and they do not know the Lord. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Therefore Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah also stumbles with them. With their flocks and herds they shall go to seek the Lord, but they will not find him. He has withdrawn himself from them. They have dealt treacherously with the Lord, for they have begotten pagan children. Now a new moon shall devour them and their heritage. Well, the message is simple, isn't it? Verse 3, sin can't be hidden. Now, there's a tenderness in verse 3, which perhaps we've missed. I know Ephraim. The word know is a very tender word in the Old Testament. It's a searchlight. So here are all these godless people who name the name of God, who are actually going on in their sin, and he's saying, well, I know all about it. Nothing is hidden. You can't hide your sin. And this is what you're doing, verse 4. Or what you're not doing, rather. You're not directing your deeds to turning to God. Sin, as you know, is commission, doing things you shouldn't, and it's omission, not doing things you should. And here are people who are not organizing their daytime and their nighttime in such a way that their life is a life of seeking God. That's what backsliding is, after all. And they won't own up to it, verse 5. There's such a thing as being hard-faced, stiff-necked in the Bible, but this is one of those references to the face. And they won't own up to their sin. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. I mean, that is the difference, isn't it, between a backslider and any other believer, or any other professed believer. One person's conscious of their sin, and they weep over it and come back to God. And another person is conscious of their sin, but won't own up to it and won't budge. And they set their face against any movement of their soul. Look where that leads, verse 5. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Therefore Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah also stumbles with them. They're going from bad to worse as they stumble down this pathway, which will quickly be the pathway of apostasy. Verse 6. We talked today about going through the motions. Look at them in verse 6. They set out with their flocks and herds. This lamb's going to be sacrificed. This one's going to be a burnt offering. This one's going to be a peace offering. They go up to some form of place of worship to seek the Lord in name, but they never find him. They go through all the motions, but they don't have any meeting with God. They take up their hymn book and sing, my God, how wonderful thou art. But there's no meeting of spirits between their spirit and the Spirit of God as they sing the hymn. The prayer is prayed, but their heart isn't in it. The scriptures are open, but they're not hearing the word of God. And there's just not that meeting. He has withdrawn himself from them. So they're going through the motions of religion, but there is no God, no touch of God in it. And look what else they're doing, verse 7. They have dealt treacherously with the Lord, because although they're going through the motions of true religion, at the same time they're going through this terrible Canaanite religion. That's treachery. And with these fertility rites, with these cult prostitutes, they are actually producing pagan children. Verse 7, at the end of the verse, is a mysterious verse, isn't it? Now a new moon shall devour them and their heritage. It probably means that God could just remove the whole nation if he pleased, and will do, in a month. So the nation is in sin. And we're coming now to the more detailed description of judgment. Verse 8. Blow the ram's horn in Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah, cry aloud in Beth Aven. Look behind you, O Benjamin. Ephraim shall be desolate in the day of rebuke. Among the tribes of Israel I make known what is sure. The princes of Israel are like those who remove a landmark. The princes of Judah are like those who remove a landmark. I will pour out my wrath on them like water. Ephraim is oppressed and broken in judgment, because he willingly walked by human precept. Therefore I will be to Ephraim like a moth, and to the house of Judah like rottenness. Now, of course, our geography may not be very strong, but it's quite a good idea to buy a Bible atlas if you haven't got maps in your Bible. And verses 8 and 9 tell us quite a bit. Where is Gibeah? Where is Ramah? Beth Aven, of course, is house of wickedness, is his nickname for Bethel, house of God. Where are these towns? Well, actually on the border between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. One or two of them actually over the border. So what is he saying? He's saying that when the judgment comes, it will go right through the land, right down to the southern tip of the land. The whole land will be judged by the invader, and even Judah actually is going to suffer from the same invader, though not yet to the same effect, as we shall see in history of the Old Testament. So God's wrath is going to go through the whole land and even over the border, verse 10, into Judah. Because Judah, the people in Judah are guilty of sin. Land grabbing is the one that's mentioned here. And don't misunderstand, verse 11, why judgment is falling. He willingly walked by human precept. That's humanism. If God's there, he's nothing to do with me. So we'll do what seems good to us. What's the least harmful for us? What appeals to us, we will do. So the judgment will come. But a tremendously different picture in verse 12. I will be to Ephraim like a moth. So the judgment won't just be invasion. We don't actually see moths too much in our wardrobes these days, but years ago virtually everybody smelled of mothballs on Sunday. Not everybody, but a lot of people. Because these horrible creatures came in and worked away all week, and then when you got out your best dress or your suit, there were large holes in it, and if you left it there for a few weeks, then it just fell to pieces. And this thing was quietly eating away until you had nothing but shreds left. And that also happens. That's also one of God's judgments. God's judgments aren't all invasion. Sometimes a nation just falls to pieces. And that may happen quietly without anything particularly traumatic happening. But the whole nation just falls to bits. And that's what's going to happen here as well. Well, 13 to 15 we'll read now, which closes the chapter. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah saw his wound, then Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to King Jareb, or the great king. Yet he could not cure you, nor heal you of your wound. I'll just stop there for a moment, but towards the end of Israel's history there was a king called Menahem. He was an upstart. He got hold of the throne by bloodshed, and he was a very nasty piece of work, frankly. One of the early things that he did in his career was to go to a town and, as an act of vengeance, mutilate all the pregnant women in that town. But when, to bolster his very fragile kingdom, he went to the king of Assyria and gave him an enormous sum of money, which he had to scrape together by putting very heavy taxation on the people. The king of Assyria took his money, and it seemed like everything was stable. But he was gone within 10 years, Menahem, and within 20 years, of course, it was the king of Assyria who actually came and destroyed that nation. So the man who took the money was the man, in fact, who came and destroyed the place in the end. That's precisely what Hosea is talking about there in verse 13. Because, verse 14, there is no escape when God judges. A lion pounces on its prey, tears the prey to bits, and God will do the same, and there will be no one to rescue. So verse 14 says, "For I will be like a lion to Ephraim, and like a young lion to the house of Judah. I, even I, will tear them and go away. I will take them away, and no one shall rescue." God comes in like a lion, takes his prey, takes it off, and no one at all can rescue. "I will return again to my place till they acknowledge their offense. Then they will seek my face. In their affliction they will diligently seek me. So I will remain withdrawn until." I will hold back my mercy until they seek my face. They'll have to go through all these terrible judgments until they diligently seek me. Well, there's a brief overview of the chapter. Here are 5 straightforward lessons. Nothing is hidden. Verse 3. I've read that hundreds of times in the Bible. I still find it very, very searching. Nothing is hidden. Nothing's hidden in a nation, nothing's hidden in a church, nothing's hidden in a family, and nothing's hidden in me. Nothing is hidden. There is not a secret in my life as far as God is concerned. Second lesson. Sin is serious. That's precisely why he keeps using this word prostitution. There it is again in verse 3, harlotry in some versions. And there it is in verse 4. Sin is prostitution. It is a failure to love God and to love something else with the love which you should reserve for God alone. But sin is a failure to love God. It expresses itself again in verse 11. He willingly walked by human precept. To walk in your own wisdom is a form of spiritual prostitution. To make up your own ideas of what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, what's wholesome and what isn't, is a form of spiritual prostitution when God has spoken. So sin is serious. The third lesson is that there are different sorts of judgment. 3 are mentioned here. Traumatic invasion. Sometimes God judges like that. Moths. Rottenness. Sometimes they're just the quiet disintegration of a nation, of a church, of a person's life. And withdrawing, which surely must be one of God's most common judgments to people who are playing fast and loose with sin. That they go through the motions of religion, they go through the motions of faithfulness, but there is no meeting with God. Fourth lesson. We're told here what we should not do. Verse 5. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Because, you see, they were pretending nothing was wrong. Verse 13. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah saw his wound, then Ephraim went to Assyria. The real problem is your relationship with God, says Hosea. The inevitable consequences of walking out on God will come upon you. And all you're trying to do is save yourself the consequences rather than putting the whole thing straight. which is getting back into a right relationship with God. But hidden in all this, there is still tenderness. So the fifth lesson is that the way of forgiveness is always open. It's always open. That's why sin is madness. That's why backsliding is madness. Because the way of forgiveness is always open. Verse 4. They do not direct their deeds toward turning to their God. For the spirit of prostitution is in their midst, and they do not know the Lord. But you see, you couldn't say a thing like that unless there was such a thing as turning to God. Unless there was such a thing as knowing the Lord. And verse 15, I will return again to my place, this is the Lord speaking, till they acknowledge their offense. Then they will seek my face. In their affliction they will diligently seek me. So there is such a thing as seeking God. Being so moved by my sin and my foolishness that I turn to seek Him. And we see therefore once more that Hosea is a preparation for the great gospel days in which we live. The next chapter, which we shall look at, God willing, in 2 weeks' time, is of course this great call to come and return to the Lord. And God saying, how shall I give you up? And from the stern thunder of chapter 5, we go to a chapter of rare tenderness. All these aspects are here. But there's tonight's passage, and there are some of the lessons.